If you want your ice to keep for an extended trip in your coolers, then this video is for you.
Have you wondered how we eat so luxuriously on the river and how we keep all of our perishables cold? Today we're gonna go over what makes that possible.
We've kept perishable meals cold for over 7 days on some of our extended trips.
We're gonna go over the planning, prepping, packing, and cooking of some of our favorite meals. First and foremost, cooler performance, cooler space, and weight restrictions of your yak are some things you're gonna want to consider. This will be different for everyone depending on the boats and coolers that you and your friends have.
Now, some people wanna run out and buy the highest quality cooler they can find, which is great, and I do suggest that you get a really high quality cooler. But the first consideration that you need to make is, will the cooler fit in your boat? So I refuse to buy into name brand hype and stayed away from Yeti coolers up until last year when I finally bought a 35 quart Yeti. The main reason that I bought it is because it fit perfectly in between the gunnels of my NuCanoe Unlimited. However, since having it for about a year now, I've come to realize that it is in fact an incredible cooler and typically retains ice longer than any of the other hard coolers that any of our friends use. You may also be considering using soft coolers. And while we do use a combination of hard and soft coolers just will not make it the duration of an extended trip. Soft coolers are great for weight savings. They can also be really easy to access depending on the type of soft cooler you get. I have had a couple of soft coolers break on me. I think the zipper is the weak point. You really need to keep those zippers lubricated. I recently switched to an Otterbox, which unfortunately is discontinued, but it doesn't use a zipper to open and close. Beer 30. You also need to be careful with how you lash soft coolers down, because if you crush the insulation with a bungee, it's not going to perform as well. This is also part of the reason why I've switched to carabiners over bungees. The other thing you need to take into account with your coolers is, of course, the color. While we obviously want to have our favorite color or match our kayak or whatever, we want the lightest color that's available in the store that day. Why can't they all just be white or light tan colored? I really don't understand. So many coolers are dark, and it's not rocket science. That's gonna heat the cooler up faster.
When you fill your coolers, you're going to want to stick to about a 1-to-2 ratio of food to ice. We rarely depart with less than 2 coolers. The first cooler we usually fill with beverages or things that we might consume within the first day. The second cooler we pack with the remainder of the meals.
Depending on the length of your trip, that first cooler's ice is gonna melt within the first 2 or 3 days. You're gonna be in and out of it a lot getting your drinks or those first few meals. We do not want to open that second cooler at all until it's time to get a meal out of it.
Already. Cheers.
If we have a lot of meals or meals for a lot of people, the soft cooler just becomes the drinks only cooler. And if I don't have cold drinks by the 3rd or 4th day, it's really not that big of a deal. But stuff that must stay cold, like perishable meats, is gonna live in a hard, well-insulated cooler. A little hack you might try for enhancing the insulation of one of your hard coolers is taking some of that foil bubble insulation, cutting it into the shape of the lid, and taping it inside the lid of your cooler. You want the shiny side facing downward towards your ice. Well, I've seen some people use this type of foil insulation on the outside of their cooler, and that may work great. We're just not really willing to put this insane shiny stuff on the outside of our boats and blind each other with whatever sort of reflection that's gonna cause. I also don't want it to get all wet and slimy and gross and fall apart on the boat. So we just haven't quite made it there yet. However, we do like to cover our hard coolers with something on the boat, whether that's your trash bag, some towels, or just whatever else you have laying around in your boat. It definitely can't hurt to add anything else that's gonna insulate the top of that cooler or prevent direct sun.
So once I figure out what coolers I'm taking on our trip, I like to puzzle in all the various Tupperware that I have into the cooler and see how it all fits.
It's like the most insane game of plastic Tetris I've ever seen.
That game of Tetris allows me to see how many containers will be able to fit in each one of the coolers. Then comes the fun part. You actually get to decide what meals you want to take on the trip with you. Some of these meals can get very involved, and there's 90-degree nights where I really just don't feel like cooking a 4-course banquet over a hot campfire, so I try to mix it up a little bit.
It's nice bringing your personal chef out onto the river with you.
That's what women are for, they stay in the kitchen.
Whoa, just bring the kitchen with us.
After creating a loose meal plan, I then compare that to the Tupperware that I had allocated and set aside earlier. Here's a few things I learned the hard way. When choosing your Tupperware containers, make sure that they have a watertight seal. There's nothing like being at the end of your trip and finding all of your ice is melted and your meals just completely waterlogged.
Hear that nice seal?
It doesn't mean that you have to break the bank and go buy really expensive new containers, but grandma's old snap together Tupperware probably isn't gonna work for this.
The biggest thing is to make sure that it has the rubber gasket or seal around the lid. In that game of Tetris, you're going to want to try to find containers that stack together well.
Odd-shaped containers or Tupperware that doesn't stack well together or has overhangs can leave air gaps inside the cooler that will melt your ice faster.
Plan to eat meals that take up space first. One of our favorite meals is campfire nachos, and while the bags of chips don't necessarily take up cooler space, they do take up a lot of space on the Kayak. Eating them first can keep them from getting crushed, or if somebody tips over, from getting waterlogged. It also keeps them away from pests. I'm not gonna try to do this while you're eating chips. Extra pro tip, keep the food off of the yaks of those who consider themselves daredevils. Soggy chips are no fun.
No.
Prepare as much as you can at home. This will be heavily dependent on the meals that you choose to make, but doing all the work in the kitchen and not on the side of the river just makes for a much more enjoyable experience. Store-bought packaging has to go. With the rare exception, things are not packed in a conducive manner to take on the river. Styrofoam packaging, plastic wrap, it all either just takes up way too much space or creates too much trash. If you have any condiment bottles or jars with labels, it's also a really good idea to remove them ahead of time. The labels on those will deteriorate and leave a big mess at the bottom of your cooler. Pre-cook your meat. So unless you're bringing along a birthday steak or some other form of shelf-stable meat, make your life easier and go ahead and pre-cook them. Even pre-cooking your meat, you will still get that delicious smoke flavor from the fire. Make sure when you cook to go ahead and season. So if you're making something like taco meat or pulled pork, go ahead and pre-season and pre-cook them all ahead of time. This goes a long way towards preventing meat juice or liquids ending up where they shouldn't be in your cooler. Cooked meat also usually shrinks in size, so it makes it easier to package in smaller containers. Moving on to veggies. Some I just toss in the cooler whole, like those I use for kebabs. That will help them stay crisp. If you're making something such as chili or soup, I'd go ahead and chop them all up and put them in a container together. When it comes to choosing veggies that'll stay fresh, I like to equate it to how long they will last in the fridge. A carrot can stay crisp, even cut, for several days. Mushrooms, not so much. So along with pre-cooking your meats and chopping your vegetables, go ahead and freeze them. The goal here is to keep things as cold as possible for as long as possible. So for example, if you're not eating chicken tacos until the 4th day on your trip, go ahead and throw your pre-seasoned, pre-shredded chicken in the bottom of the deep freeze. This can also apply to marinated meats. Chicken breasts, kebabs, they can all be frozen. Do not do this if you're planning on eating this as one of your first meals, otherwise you'll be pulling out a frozen hunk of meat. Pre-assemble as many meals as you can ahead of time. Breakfast burritos are a perfect example of this. You can make the burrito, wrap in foil, and all you have to do is throw it over the fire when you're ready to cook it.
All this food that's frozen ahead of time just adds to the ice in your cooler. Now obviously food doesn't freeze the same way water does, so it's not gonna last quite as long as ice, but it does add to that 1-to-2 ice to food ratio. All right, so most of you ought to know that you need to pre-chill your coolers. If you don't know what that means, you need to pack your coolers full of sacrificial ice the day before the trip. Some of that ice is gonna melt, and that's okay. You're gonna have more than you need anyway. It's just to prevent there from being any warm air in the cooler. That was so loud. You also want to get any items, even the ones you're not freezing, as cold as possible before putting them in a cooler. Never place something that hasn't already been chilled or refrigerated in a cooler, or it's going to start your ice melting faster. So I had an idea that we would bring my really large cooler that of course won't fit on any kayaks, and we load that with ice as well and put all of the food in there to keep it chilled. We like to show up at the launch the day before we actually get on the river and camp out that night. This way all of the food stays chilled, all of our coolers stay pre-chilled, and then we can divvy out the food into the coolers accordingly the next morning, and we have tons of leftover ice. Now since we're in a pickup truck and taking precious cargo like a kid or dogs that have to ride in the cab with us, sometimes we're just not able to. But if you can, store the coolers in the cab of your vehicle on the way down to the river. There's no point in senselessly melting a bunch of your ice while you're in transit to your trip destination.
Label everything that's going into your cooler and you plan on keeping cold.
Leaving the lid of your coolers open for too long while you dig around for unlabeled items that you don't know where they are in your coolers will allow too much warm air in and melt your ice much faster.
This is also helpful when you have multiple containers used for the same meal.
This might seem like overkill if you're traveling by yourself, but if you've got a large group of people, this is an absolute lifesaver for organization. Our coolers and boats alone won't fit all the food for big group meals that we bring on some of our trips with a ton of people. So you'll need to communicate with everyone who's going and figure out who has what cooler space. That way you can split the meals up amongst different people's coolers. But again, if you want food to last for a long time, you're gonna have to have certain coolers that don't get open till the end of the trip, and make sure that your floating companions understand that. So once your coolers are pre-chilled and all your food items are organized and packed, it's time to load up the coolers. It's a common practice to use both block and chip ice. Block ice will stay cold for much longer, and chip ice will fill in the gaps in your cooler to make sure that there's no air. It should also be said that if you know when you're eating which meals, to put the meals that you're eating first on the top of the cooler and the meals that you're eating last towards the bottom. This way you can grab them out more quickly and get that lid closed sooner. So here's a hint. Breakfast at the top, dinner at the bottom. There's several different ways to create block ice. You could fill a 9x13 pan with water and throw it in the deep freeze and knock your ice block out of that. You could fill a Ziploc freezer bag full of water and freeze it that way. This is kind of risky because if the bag ruptures, you're gonna have a serious mess in your freezer. Or you can use water bottles. Water bottles make great block ice because once they melt, you have drinking water that you don't have to filter. Don't drain the water from your ice melt out of your coolers. That water is filling in the air gaps and it's way more dense than air, so it's gonna keep your cooler cold. If you've used everything from your day one or early trip cooler and there's still ice or really cold ice melt in there, you may as well dump it into your day two or late trip cooler to make sure that it stays even longer. Another thing you really need to think about is pest control. We're in Missouri, so while we do have a small population of black bears, we generally don't camp in areas where bears are of concern. If you do, certain types of food containers just won't do at all. You need to make sure that if you're bringing a cooler that it's bear rated, or that you're just using dehydrated meals and cranking that barrel up into a tree, just like the directions prescribe. What we deal with typically is raccoons, and they are ruthless. They'll chew through bags, gaskets, coolers, dry storage compartments, or even enter right on into your tent with you uninvited.
Cuddle buddy.
Keep this in mind before putting food in a valuable or expensive dry bag. The last thing you want is your awesome remote designs bag to have a hole in it thanks to Mr. Raccoon. You've got everything planned, prepped and organized, and your coolers are packed and you're out on the river. All right, let's cook some delicious meals. Ooh, whoa, okay, I'm running late to work. Leia's gonna finish up. See you guys on the river.
Almost all of the meals that I make are done over a fire. You might not have the option to have an open fire or the desire to have to make one every single time you cook a meal. If this is your case, you might have to check in with local authorities or look into purchasing a small camp cook stove. We keep fire starting pretty simple. We usually carry a lighter and nothing else. Sometimes if we know it's gonna be wet, we'll bring along a little bit of fire starter or lint. Otherwise, we use just what's on the riverbank. Our mattress pump can also give the fire an extra boost if it needs it. A small campfire grill has also become a staple for me. It helps being able to regulate temperature, and also I'm not worried about my food tipping off and spilling. For most trips, I pack my Dutch oven along with a stainless steel skillet. The size of these is depending on the groups that I'm cooking for. I bring along our folding long-handled spoon and spatula, and for extra large groups, I'll sometimes bring the thick-bottomed heavy aluminum pans to cook meals in. You will want a good fire glove or hot pad. So as soon as you've eaten your meal and you're full and content and the last thing you want to do is be cleaning up, go ahead and throw some water in your pan and start scraping all the yucky stuff off the bottom. After my pan is deglazed, I'll usually do one of two things. One, I'll either grab some silt or sand off the riverbed and use it as a scrub brush to clean out the pan, or two, I'll go ahead and grab the scrub daddy that I usually bring along. I rarely use soap on my cookware. By the time that I've deglazed and scrubbed them all out, I will usually just throw them back over the fire to be sanitized. I know there are a lot of emotions and opinions surrounding cast iron, and you may disagree with me, but generally I follow two rules of cast iron on the river. One, keep it as dry as possible, and two, keep it well seasoned and oiled. Generally, if I am able to deglaze my pan as soon as I'm finished cooking, rinse it out and re-oil it, I don't have any issues. For oiling my Dutch oven and for just general cooking, I like to bring along a jar of clarified butter. It doesn't require refrigeration and so far seems to do a great job of seasoning my cast iron as well. Once our float is over and we're back home unpacking, I will make sure to pull the cast iron out and have it completely dry. You don't want it to rust. Usually this involves me doing a whole reseasoning process in the oven. So now that we've shared a whole boatload of information on how you can get started with your kayak cooking camping adventure, we will leave a list below of some of our favorite meals to take on the river. Don't forget to leave a comment sharing some of your favorite meals. And remember, adventure